Let us step back into a winter afternoon in the year 1825, in the small town of Johnstown, New York. The sky is a pale gray and a soft snow has just begun to fall over the rooftops. Along the main street, the clapboard houses stand shoulder to shoulder, their windows glowing faintly with the light of oil lamps. Smoke curls from chimneys and drifts lazily into the cold air. The streets are quiet, muffled by the fresh layer of white, and the only sound is the distant jingle of a sleigh moving slowly through the town square. In one of the finer homes on the corner of Market Street, a brick Federal-style house with black shutters and a wide front porch, a girl of 10 years old sits at the window, watching the snow gather on the sill. Her name is Elizabeth Cady, and this is the world she knows best. Inside the house, the air is warm and smells of pine logs burning in the fireplace. The furniture is heavy and dark, mahogany tables, horsehair sofas, thick wool rugs that hush every footstep. In the parlor, a tall clock ticks slowly, its pendulum catching the firelight. The walls are lined with bookshelves that hold leather-bound volumes of law, theology, and history. This is the home of Daniel Cady, a respected judge and a man who believes deeply in the order of things. Elizabeth's mother, Margaret, often rests upstairs, still carrying the sadness of losing several children in their infancy. So the house is quiet, often too quiet for a spirited girl who longs to understand why things are the way they are. Elizabeth wanders into her father's study one afternoon, drawn by the scent of old paper and ink. The room is dim except for a single lamp on the great oak desk. She runs her small fingers over the spines of law books, some so heavy she can hardly lift them. She does not yet understand the words, contracts, property, coverture, but she senses they hold immense power. One day, a young widow comes to the house, her face lined with worry, and Elizabeth overhears her father explain that the law leaves her with almost nothing. The woman nods, her hands clasped tight. After she leaves, Elizabeth tugs at her father's sleeve and asks why the law cannot help her. Judge Cady sighs and says, "It is the law, child, and I cannot change it." Those words settle into Elizabeth's heart like a stone dropped into still water. At night, Elizabeth lies in her bed under a thick feather quilt, watching the shadows from the fireplace dance on the ceiling. The house settles into its evening rhythm, the creak of footsteps in the hall, the distant murmur of her father's voice as he talks with a colleague, the wind brushing snow against the windowpane. She thinks about the widow's face, about the law books that sat mute and unmoving on the shelf. She feels the first flicker of a quiet, unnameable resolve. In the darkness, she does not yet know she will spend a lifetime learning how to speak. But the seed is planted here in the warmth of a winter's night, in the soft silence of a girl's bedroom in Johnstown. Morning comes slowly in the judge's house, with pale sunlight streaming through lace curtains and pooling on the wide floorboards of the kitchen. The cook stirs a pot of oatmeal while the aroma of fresh bread fills the air. Elizabeth helps set the table, the porcelain plates cool under her fingertips. Through the back window, she can see the long slope of the garden buried under snow, the bare limbs of the apple trees traced in frost. The world outside is peaceful, almost motionless, and inside, life follows its gentle routines. But Elizabeth's mind is already elsewhere, reaching towards something she cannot yet name. The rhythm of domestic life will always be part of her. She will later write about the dignity and burden of housekeeping, but even as a child, she senses that there is more waiting beyond the garden gate. On clear winter afternoons, Elizabeth sometimes walks with her older sister through the snowy lanes of Johnstown. They pass the stone church with its tall steeple, the general store with barrels of flour and sugar in the window, the blacksmith's forge where orange sparks fly briefly into the air. The townspeople nod politely, their breath forming little clouds. Everything seems orderly and calm, yet Elizabeth notices the small ways women's lives are cordoned off. They walk back as the sun starts to sink, and the whole town is bathed in a golden pink light that makes the snow glow. It is a scene of almost perfect stillness, and the girl tucks it away in her memory, a picture of the world she will later work to reshape with words. The winter light fades early, and by late afternoon the house is full of long shadows and the soft tick of the clock. Elizabeth sits on the rug near the fireplace, a book of history open on her lap, and tries to find stories of women who changed laws. She finds very few, but she reads anyway, driven by a patient hunger. Outside, lanterns begin to appear in neighboring windows, small beacons against the deepening blue of evening. The world grows smaller, cozier, until finally her mother calls her to supper, and the day in the judge's house draws to a gentle close. As Elizabeth grows taller, the study becomes her refuge. She learns to read the heavy law books slowly, sounding out the Latin phrases that seem to wrap around women's lives like invisible chains. Her father, when he is home, sometimes sits across from her and explains the legal reasoning behind the doctrine of coverture, how a married woman's identity is absorbed into her husband's, how she cannot own property or keep her wages. Elizabeth listens with a deep, serious attention, her brow furrowed in the lamplight. Outside, the seasons turn, the apple trees bloom, the summer grasses grow tall, autumn paints the hills in crimson and gold. But inside the study, time is measured in pages turned and questions asked. One summer afternoon, Elizabeth's father hosts a gathering of fellow judges and lawyers in the garden. The men sit under the shade of elm trees, their voices a low, pleasant rumble as they discuss cases. Elizabeth, now 13, is allowed to bring them lemonade on a tray. She moves quietly among them, invisible as the breeze. She pauses to listen to one man describe a case of a woman who pleaded to keep her farm after her husband drank away the family savings. The men shake their heads, not in pity, but in resigned acceptance of the law's limits. Elizabeth feels a surge of heat rise in her chest, but she says nothing. She simply refills their glasses and retreats into the house, where she writes down everything she heard in a small leather notebook she keeps hidden under her mattress. In the evenings, she often sits with her older brother Tryphina's memory hovering in the house. He had died a few years before, and her father had grieved that he had lost all his sons. Elizabeth, hearing that sorrow, resolved to become everything a son would have been. She studied Greek, she read philosophy, she even learned to ride a horse at a full gallop, her hair streaming behind her. But the law books were where she felt closest to the absent brother, as if by mastering them she could fill a space in her father's heart. The lamplight would burn late, and her mother would come in to gently close the book and lead her to bed. In those quiet nights, the house felt full of both grief and determination, woven together like threads in a tapestry. It is during these years that Elizabeth first encounters the power of polite conversation as a shield for injustice. At a neighbor's tea, she listens as the women talk about dress patterns and preserving fruit, while in another room the men discuss politics and reform. She notices how the women's voices drop when a man enters, how they defer with a smile. The afternoon sunlight falls gently on the lace tablecloth and the silver teaspoons, and everything appears perfectly harmonious. But Elizabeth begins to see that this harmony is propped up by a kind of erasure, a gentle vanishing act performed by women every day. That evening, she writes in her notebook, "Why is it that the minds of women are so carefully kept from growing?" The question glows like a small candle in the dark. As she approaches 17, Elizabeth's world expands slightly when she is sent to the Troy Female Seminary, run by Emma Willard. The journey takes her through the Hudson River Valley in early autumn. She watches from the stagecoach window as the landscape unfolds, fields of goldenrod, distant blue mountains, rivers flashing silver in the sunlight. The seminary itself is a large, elegant building with white columns, surrounded by lawns sloping down to the water. Here, girls study mathematics, science, and philosophy, and Elizabeth drinks in the learning like a desert traveler. The days are structured, calm, filled with the scratch of pen on paper and the rustle of turning pages. Still, she notices that even this enlightened place does not grant diplomas to women, as if their education were a pretty ornament rather than a true tool. At night in the dormitory, Elizabeth lies awake listening to the breathing of her classmates. Moonlight spills through the tall windows and silvers the floorboards. She thinks about the law books back home, about the widow's face, about the conversations she has never been allowed to join. In the silence, she makes a quiet vow. She will never accept that women's minds are inferior. She will learn the law, and she will find a way to change it. The moonlight seems to hold its breath with her. Outside, the river moves slowly, carrying autumn leaves toward the sea, and the world sleeps on, unaware of the small, steady fire kindling in the heart of a girl who will one day shake its foundations. Years later, when people ask her where it all began, Elizabeth will think back to these moments: the law books in the lamplight, the garden party, the dormitory moon. She will say that the sense of injustice was not a sudden storm, but a slow, patient tide. And so this chapter of her life ends like the closing of a book at bedtime. The lamp is turned down, the house settles, and the young woman's mind, full of half-formed dreams, drifts gently toward the morning when she will begin to speak them aloud. Elizabeth Cady's path turns toward love in the early 1840s, and like everything in her life, it comes not with a storm but with a slow, steady light. She is now a young woman with a sharp mind and a warm laugh, living for a time in Peterborough, New York, with her cousin Gerrit Smith, a known abolitionist. The Smith home is a bustling place, always full of reformers, fugitives seeking safe passage, and earnest talk by the fireside. It is here, in the soft glow of a late spring afternoon, that she meets Henry Brewster Stanton. He is an abolitionist speaker, 10 years her senior, with a calm, thoughtful manner and eyes that listen before they speak. He stands by the window, and the light falls across his face as he talks about the anti-slavery movement. Elizabeth finds herself drawn not into a whirlwind, but into something deeper and quieter. Their courtship unfolds in a series of long walks along the country lanes of Peterborough. The roads are lined with stone fences and wild roses that send their fragrance into the warm air. They talk for hours about slavery, about women's roles, about the law, about the stars they can see from the porch at night. Henry does not flatter or overpower. He asks what she thinks, and he listens. This, to Elizabeth, is a kind of magic. One evening, as the sun sets and the sky turns lavender and peach, they pause by an old oak tree. Henry speaks of a future built on equality, a home where both can work for justice. Elizabeth feels the words settle in her chest like a key turning in a lock. The world around them is so still that they can hear a distant cowbell and the soft rustle of leaves. When they decide to marry, Elizabeth insists on a ceremony stripped of the usual vows that would place her under Henry's legal authority. She wants no promise to obey, and Henry agrees without hesitation. The wedding is held in the Smith parlor on a mild May morning in 1840. Sunlight streams through the lace curtains, touching the bouquets of lilacs set on the mantelpiece. Only a small group of family and friends gathers, their voices a gentle murmur. The minister reads the words, but Elizabeth has removed the offending clause. Standing there in her simple gray dress, she feels not the loss of self that the law demanded, but a quiet expansion, as if the very act of rewriting the ceremony has already begun to remake the world. Afterward, they share a meal of cold meats, fresh bread, and rhubarb pie, and the house hums with gentle laughter until evening. Soon after the wedding, the couple embarks on a voyage to London, where Henry will attend the World Anti-Slavery Convention. The ship is a sailing vessel, its white canvas billowing against a blue summer sky. Elizabeth stands at the rail, watching the coastline of America shrink into a thin green line. The sea is calm, and the days pass in a slow rhythm of reading, writing in her journal, and watching the endless horizon. At night, the stars are astonishingly bright, and the water murmurs against the hull. It is a time of suspended animation, a gentle parenthesis between the life she has known and the life she will build. In London, she meets Lucretia Mott, a Quaker minister and abolitionist, and their friendship will become a cornerstone of everything to come. But for now, the voyage is purely peaceful waves, wind, and the quiet presence of her new husband. In London, the young couple takes modest lodgings in a narrow, cobbled street where the morning light falls in soft shafts between the buildings. Every day, Elizabeth walks to the convention hall, a grand stone building with tall arched windows. Inside, however, she learns that women delegates are not allowed to speak or vote. They are to sit in a curtained gallery, hidden away. The decision is painful, but she does not rage. She sits in the dimness beside Lucretia Mott, and the two women talk in low voices about the need for a convention of their own, dedicated wholly to women's rights. The idea is a seed planted in the shade, and it will germinate slowly over the next 8 years. Outside, London bustles with carriages and flower sellers, but in that quiet gallery, among the rustle of silk and the whisper of indignities, the future is being woven. When they return to America, Henry and Elizabeth settle in Boston for a time, then finally in a white farmhouse in Seneca Falls, New York. The house stands on a hill overlooking a river and a stretch of meadows that turn golden in the autumn. Elizabeth tends a garden of vegetables and herbs while Henry travels frequently for his work. The rooms are filled with simple pine furniture, rag rugs, and always the smell of ink and paper. Mornings begin with the sound of birds and the clatter of the stove lid as Elizabeth prepares breakfast. She washes diapers, mends clothes, sweeps the floors, and in the spaces between, she writes letters, reads treatises, and continues the slow, patient work of thinking. It is an ordinary life, full of everyday textures, but it hums with a hidden purpose. During the long winter evenings in Seneca Falls, with the children asleep and the house wrapped in snow, Elizabeth sits at the small writing desk by the fire. The room is lit only by the flicker of the hearth and a single candle. She dips her pen and writes to friends about the condition of women, about the need for a public meeting. The ice cracks on the river outside, and the wind taps at the window, but inside, everything is warm and still. Henry, when he is home, brings her a cup of tea and sits reading in the chair across from her. There is a deep, quiet partnership in the room, a shared commitment that needs no grand speeches. In these nights, the outline of a revolution begins to take shape, as softly as snowflakes falling on a sleeping town. The sun rises gently on July 19, 1848, over the village of Seneca Falls. A soft mist hovers above the river and the wheat fields, and the air already carries the promise of a warm summer day. The streets are empty except for a few shopkeepers opening their doors and a milk cart rattling slowly toward the creamery. In the white farmhouse on the hill, Elizabeth Cady Stanton rises early, her mind clear and her heart steady. She has spent the previous days at a small round table with Lucretia Mott, Mary and McClintock, and 2 other women, drafting a document that will declare the rights of women in language that echoes the Declaration of Independence. Now the morning has come, and she must dress, gather her papers, and walk down into the village, where everything is about to change. She chooses a simple dress of dark blue cotton, one that allows her to move easily. In the kitchen, the cook has already prepared a light breakfast of bread and tea, and Elizabeth eats standing by the window, watching the mist lift. The children are still asleep under their cotton sheets. She kisses the youngest on the forehead and leaves a note for the older ones. Then she steps out onto the porch, where the morning light is golden and the birds are singing in the lilac bushes. The gravel path crunches softly under her shoes as she walks toward the center of town, her leather satchel holding the Declaration and her notes. The air smells of cut grass and damp earth, and the whole world seems to be waking up with a quiet purpose. The Wesleyan Chapel on Fall Street is a plain, sturdy building of pale brick, with a peaked roof and simple white trim. It has no steeple, no stained glass, only clear windows that let in the summer light. As Elizabeth approaches, she sees a small crowd already gathered outside, farmers' wives in their Sunday bonnets, a few men in dusty boots, Quaker women in dove-gray dresses. Some have walked for miles. The door stands open, and inside, the wooden pews are filling slowly. The chapel is not grand, but the light falls softly through the high windows, tracing rectangles of warmth on the plank floor. There is a low murmur of conversation, the rustle of petticoats, the creak of wood. Elizabeth walks to the front, where a simple table and chair await, and she feels the weight of history settle around her like a cloak. The convention begins not with trumpets, but with a quiet call to order. Elizabeth stands, her voice a little unsteady at first, and reads the Declaration of Sentiments aloud. "We hold these truths to be self-evident," she begins, and the words fill the room with a strange and powerful stillness. She speaks of the history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, of the denial of the elective franchise, of laws that made married women civilly dead. The sunlight shifts across the floor as she reads, and the faces of the listeners are intent, some nodding, a few with tears on their cheeks. Outside, the leaves of the maple trees flutter in a gentle breeze. Inside, the world is being remade, sentence by sentence, in a voice that is calm and clear and entirely awake. In the afternoon, the assembly discusses each resolution. Elizabeth presides with a quiet dignity, allowing voices to rise and fall. Lucretia Mott speaks with the cadence of a Quaker preacher, her words measured and full of light. Other women, like Amy Post and Martha Wright, add their voices. The room grows warm, and someone opens the windows. The scent of clover drifts in from the fields. When they reach the resolution demanding women's right to vote, there is a pause, a held breath, and then a deep and earnest debate. Even Lucretia is hesitant, fearing it will make them seem ridiculous. But Elizabeth stands firm, and Frederick Douglass, the only African American present, rises to support the measure with an eloquence that leaves the room hushed. In the end, the resolution passes by a slender majority, and the afternoon light slants deeper gold through the chapel. By early evening, the convention has done its work. 100 people, 68 women and 32 men, sign the Declaration of Sentiments. They step forward in the quiet light, one by one, dip the pen and write their names. The scratching of nibs on paper is the only sound. Elizabeth watches each signature, her heart full but her demeanor serene. She knows that tomorrow the newspapers will mock them, that the world outside this little chapel will scorn and misrepresent what they have done. But in this moment, there is only the gentle closing of a circle, a small seed of democracy planted in the soil of a quiet town. The signers shake hands, exchange quiet words, and then walk out into the evening, where the first stars are beginning to appear. Elizabeth walks home alone in the twilight, her satchel lighter now. The streets are still, the shops closed, and the river reflects the pale colors of the sky, pink, lavender, soft gray. She walks slowly, feeling the cool grass brush her skirt when she takes the path through the meadow. She does not feel triumphant, exactly. She feels peaceful, as if something long held inside her has finally been released. The house welcomes her with its familiar smells of wood smoke and bread. The children are clamoring for supper, the baby needs to be held, and the ordinary rhythm of domestic life reasserts itself. But as she lights the lamp in the parlor and sits down to feed the little ones, she knows that the morning of Seneca Falls will never truly end. It will keep shining quietly in the future she has helped to set in motion. A few years after the Seneca Falls Convention, Elizabeth's life becomes deeply intertwined with that of another woman whose name will forever be linked with hers, Susan B. Anthony. They meet in 1851 on a street corner in Seneca Falls, introduced by the abolitionist Amelia Bloomer. The weather that day is crisp and clear, the sky a high autumn blue. Elizabeth is walking with her children. Susan is tall, angular, and direct, with a gaze that seems to look straight through pretense. They stand for a moment in the shade of an oak tree, talking easily, and something clicks into place, a friendship that will become one of the great partnerships of American history. That evening, Elizabeth writes in her journal, "A strong, good woman has come into my life, and I sense everything is about to deepen." The two women quickly find a rhythm that suits their different temperaments. Elizabeth, anchored by her growing family, stays home and writes speeches, articles, letters that pour out of her like water from a spring. Susan, who is unmarried and free to travel, takes those words on the road, organizing meetings, giving lectures, enduring the dust and cold of stagecoaches and the chill of unfriendly audiences. When Susan returns, she comes straight to the farmhouse in Seneca Falls, and the two sit together in the parlor, the afternoon light falling in long golden bars across the rag rug. Susan recounts her travels. Elizabeth scribbles notes for the next campaign. Their collaboration is a quiet, steady engine, fueled by mutual respect and an abiding affection that needs no grand gestures. In the warm months, they often work in the garden under the apple trees. Elizabeth sets a small table with a pitcher of lemonade and a stack of paper, and Susan reads aloud the latest legislative reports while Elizabeth rocks the baby's cradle with her foot. The garden is a tangle of hollyhocks and roses, and bees drone lazily among the blossoms. The conversation flows back and forth, weaving together the practical and the philosophical. They discuss property laws, divorce reform, and the suffrage amendment, but they also talk about the price of flour, Susan's sore throat, Elizabeth's latest recipe for blackberry jam. This blending of monumental work and everyday domesticity is the soil in which their movement grows, and it gives their partnership a texture that is both deeply human and quietly radical. During the long winters, when travel is impossible, Susan stays for weeks at a time in the Stanton home. The snow piles high against the fence posts, and the river freezes solid. Inside, the house is warm and full of noise. Children practicing their lessons, the clatter of pots in the kitchen, the crackle of the fire. Elizabeth and Susan commandeer the dining room table, covering it with pamphlets, petitions, and inkwells. They work late into the night, their faces illuminated by the flicker of oil lamps. One such evening, they draft a call for a statewide convention to demand married women's property rights. The language is clear, precise, and burnished by Elizabeth's pen. When they finish, Susan leans back and says, "We have written a new law in hope." The room feels full of quiet power, and outside, the snow continues to fall, blanketing the world in white. Their friendship is not without its strains. Elizabeth sometimes grows frustrated that Susan cannot stay longer to help with the children, and Susan sometimes wishes Elizabeth could leave home more easily. But they never break. They write hundreds of letters when apart, paper missives that travel by post across the country, filled with encouragement, strategy, and the small intimacies of weather and health. Each letter is a bridge of words, maintaining the connection across the miles. In the evenings, Elizabeth reads Susan's letters by the fire, her children asleep at last, and feels less alone. She knows that somewhere, in a hired room in Ohio or Massachusetts, Susan is reading hers in just the same way. The thought is a comfort, like a distant star. Over the years, they produce a monumental body of work together, the first 3 volumes of the history of women's suffrage, countless petitions, and the founding of the National Women's Suffrage Association. But it is the quieter moments that Elizabeth treasures most in her later memories. Susan arriving at the gate, her bag dusty, her smile tired but bright, the two of them walking along the river at dusk, talking about the color of the sky and the stubbornness of state legislatures, sitting together in the parlor, not talking at all, simply sharing the silence like a loaf of bread. The movement they build is not a battle won in a day, but a slow, steady turning of the earth toward the sun, and their friendship is the axis on which it turns. One late summer afternoon, when they are both older and the fight has mellowed from urgent to enduring, they sit on the porch of Elizabeth's new home in Tenafly, New Jersey. The light is amber, the air soft with the approach of evening. Susan knits. Elizabeth reads aloud from a book of poetry. The leaves of the oak trees rustle overhead, and a robin sings from the fence post. They do not speak of the movement. They are simply two friends in a sunlit room of the world, having traveled a long road together. The scene is so ordinary, so gentle, that it could be any two elderly companions sharing a quiet hour. And yet it is extraordinary, because the stillness between them contains decades of struggle, love, and an unshakable belief that women deserve to be free. As the decades pass, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's work shifts inward. The woman who once stood in the Wesleyan chapel now spends more and more of her time in the stillness of her study, with a pen in her hand and a fire crackling softly in the grate. Her children are grown, the house is quieter, and the landscape of her mind has become the primary terrain of her activism. She writes for newspapers, for journals, for the endless stream of letters that keep the suffrage network alive. But she also begins to write books that go deeper: The Woman's Bible, her autobiography 80 Years and More, and scores of essays on marriage, religion, and the soul of democracy. This is the season of her life when the external noise fades and the inner voice takes center stage, calm and uncompromising. Her study in the Tenafly house is a small, cozy room overlooking the garden. The walls are lined with books, and the desk is always covered with a gentle chaos of manuscripts, newspaper clippings, and teacups. In the morning, the light pours in through the east window, and Elizabeth sits down to work while the dew still glistens on the grass. She writes slowly, deliberately, crossing out more than she keeps. The act of writing is for her both a discipline and a comfort, a way of clarifying the world. She believes that the subordination of women is rooted not just in law, but in centuries of religious teaching, and she follows that thread wherever it leads, even when it takes her into territory that makes her allies uncomfortable. In 1895, she publishes The Woman's Bible, a line-by-line commentary on the passages of scripture that have been used to justify women's suppression. The book causes a storm of controversy within the suffrage movement itself, many fearing it will alienate religious supporters. But Elizabeth is past caring about respectability. She works on the manuscript for 2 years in the peace of her study, surrounded by reference Bibles in Greek and Hebrew, dictionaries, and the fading light of winter afternoons. Outside, the garden lies dormant under frost, and the house is still. She writes with a calm fury, every line a quiet declaration that women must interpret their own sacred texts, must claim the power to read and think for themselves. The book is not a battle cry. It is a deep, resonant meditation, the product of a lifetime's reflection. Despite the public criticism, Elizabeth remains serene. She receives letters of support from women across the country, many of them homemakers and teachers who have felt the weight of the very passages she is dismantling. She reads these letters by the fire in the evening, and they warm her more than the flames. In her responses, she does not rally them to action, but encourages them to study, to think, to trust their own minds. Her influence now travels through ink and paper, a quiet ministry that requires no platform, only the patient exchange of words. The garden outside is her sanctuary. In the spring, she tends the roses and the peonies, and the rhythm of digging and pruning calms her after hours of intellectual labor. Nature and writing become two halves of a single peaceful whole. In her later years, Elizabeth reflects a great deal on the meaning of a life spent in reform. She receives visitors on the porch of her home, younger suffragists who have read her works and come to pay homage. They arrive in high-necked dresses and feathered hats, full of energy and questions. Elizabeth answers them gently, her voice softer now, her hair white as the cloud that passes overhead. They walk together through the garden paths, talking about the new century that is about to dawn. Elizabeth speaks of the slow progress of justice, comparing it to the growth of the oak tree that shades the lawn, something that cannot be hurried, but that will, in time, provide shelter for all. The young women listen, their heads bowed in the golden light, and carry her words away like seeds. As the twilight of her life draws near, Elizabeth writes more personal pieces, memoirs of her childhood, portraits of friends long gone, meditations on aging. She writes about the sound of rain on the roof, the smell of baking bread, the joy of holding a grandchild on her knee. These writings are full of sensory detail, quiet observations that root her huge ideas in the soil of everyday life. She is still a radical, but she is also a grandmother, a neighbor, a friend. The great public drama of Seneca Falls seems far away now, but the light from that morning still shines in every sentence she sets down. She has become what she once hoped to be, a woman whose words are her own, freely given, freely received. On a warm autumn evening in 1902, Elizabeth sits by the window, watching the leaves fall in slow spirals onto the lawn. A granddaughter plays with a kitten on the floor. The lamp is lit. She picks up her pen one final time, not to write a speech or a polemic, but a simple letter to Susan, who is far away. She writes of the garden, of the book she is reading, of the peace she feels. The letter ends with the words, "I am at rest with the world, and the world is better than we found it." Then she sets down the pen, folds the paper, and sits quietly as the evening deepens. The room is full of shadows and light, and her life's work is complete. Elizabeth Cady Stanton dies on October 26, 1902, in her home in New York City, a few weeks shy of her 87th birthday. The day before, she had asked for her favorite blue dress to be laid out and had dictated a letter to President Theodore Roosevelt, urging him to support women's suffrage. The end comes not with a great struggle, but with a gentle slipping away, like a tide going out. The windows of her room face west, and in the afternoon, the light fills the space with a soft amber glow. Her daughter Margaret and a few close friends are with her, speaking in low, soothing voices. Outside, the city hums with the ordinary sounds of carriages and street vendors, but inside the room, there is only peace and the quiet rasp of an old woman's breath, slowly stilling. The house where she dies is a tall brownstone on a tree-lined street, not unlike the one where she was born so many years before in Johnstown. In those final days, she drifts in and out of memory, seeing again the snow falling on the judge's house, the lamplight in the study, the faces of the women gathered in the Wesleyan chapel. She speaks sometimes of her children, sometimes of Susan, sometimes of the garden. Those who listen understand that she is not lost to them, but simply traveling back through the layers of a long, purposeful life. The room is kept dim and quiet, with fresh flowers on the bedside table, asters and chrysanthemums in gentle autumn hues. The nurse opens the window a crack, and the cool air carries the smell of wood smoke and damp leaves. News of her passing spreads slowly through the network of reformers she helped to create. Telegrams and letters crisscross the country, carrying messages of mourning and gratitude. In Seneca Falls, the chapel stands empty in the evening light, its wooden pews silent, its windows reflecting the sunset. A few older women who were there in 1848 walk up Fall Street, arm in arm, and pause outside the building. They do not go in, but stand quietly, remembering the summer morning when a tall woman in a blue dress read words that changed their lives. The sky deepens from orange to violet, and the first star appears above the steepleless roof. It is a scene of almost complete stillness, as if the whole town is holding its breath in honor of a life well lived. Susan B. Anthony, who survives her by almost 4 years, receives the news in Rochester. She is sitting in her own parlor, a shawl around her shoulders, when the telegram arrives. For a long moment, she cannot speak. Then she says, "The world has lost its greatest woman, and I have lost my dearest friend." She walks to the window and looks out at the bare branches of the elm trees against the gray sky. In her hand, she holds the last letter Elizabeth wrote her, the one about the garden and the book and the autumn leaves. She will keep that letter in her desk for the rest of her days, taking it out on quiet evenings to read the familiar handwriting. The friendship they built over 50 years remains, a steady flame that death cannot extinguish. In the years that follow, the suffrage movement continues its slow, incremental progress, finally achieving the federal amendment in 1920, 18 years after Elizabeth's death. It is called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, but its roots run deep into the soil that Elizabeth turned. The women who march in the final parades, who cast their first votes, who work in the legislatures, all carry a piece of her legacy. They might not know the name of the farmhouse in Seneca Falls or the color of the dress she wore, but they know the ideas, the phrases, the calm insistence that women are fully human. And that knowledge is like an echo of her voice, repeating softly through the decades. Today, the Wesleyan Chapel is preserved as part of the Women's Rights National Historical Park. Visitors walk through its doors and feel the same gentle light that filled the room in 1848. They see the simple benches, the plain white walls, and they hear the recorded voice of a park ranger reading the Declaration of Sentiments. The place is still, almost sacred in its unassummingness. Outside, the river flows as it always has, carrying reflections of the sky. A garden has been planted nearby, with benches where travelers can sit and think. On a summer afternoon, you can hear the bees humming among the lavender, and you can imagine her there, not as a statue, but as a woman who sat at a table and wrote words that made the world wider. And so the story of Elizabeth Cady Stanton comes to rest like the evening sun sinking below the horizon. It is a story not of conquest, but of quiet cultivation. The seeds she planted continue to blossom in places she never saw, in lives she never knew. Her voice, preserved in ink and memory, still speaks in the hush of libraries, in the chambers of law, in the quiet conversations between women who dare to ask why. As the night falls on our telling, let us imagine her at peace, walking in a garden under a fading sky, her work finished, her heart at rest. The stars come out one by one, and the world sleeps a little more fairly because she was here.